Podcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us as we continue the 2022 NACOL webinar series, a place where we can bring you information on the practice of civilian oversight, innovations in the field, and important work being done in the arena of criminal justice reform. I'm particularly excited that you have joined us today as we turn the conversation to the use of police commissions as a method to achieving accountability. Before we begin, however, I would like to remind all of you that you have entered today's session in listen-only mode. During the webinar, you will have the ability to type in any questions you might have, and those questions will then be posed to today's speakers following their presentation. I'd like to also remind you that today's meeting is being recorded and will be made available on the NACOL website at a later date. With that, I will now hand it over to NACOL board member Flo Finkel, who also chairs the Training, Education, and Standards Committee, the NACOL committee responsible for producing our webinar series. Flo has spent the last 30 years working to hold law enforcement officers accountable for committing crimes and or violating internal department policies and improving law enforcement practices and accountability systems. She's done this by prosecuting corrupt police officers at the New York County District Attorney's Office, helping to build and professionalize the New York City Civilian Complaint Review Board as its Deputy Executive Director for Investigations and as its Executive Director, and as the New York City Department of Corrections Deputy Commissioner for Integrity and Policy, where I might add her investigations led to the indictments against 23 correctional officers. With that, I will turn it over to you, Flo, as the moderator of today's session. Flo?
Thank you, Cami. The TES committee is proud to put on this webinar today. Let me just tee it up and then I'm going to introduce our panelists. Over the last several decades, there's been a significant focus generally on three types of civilian oversight models: the independent investigative agency, the review-focused agency, which reviews internal police department investigations, and the auditor or monitor or inspector general entity or agency. These models produce outcomes that usually consist of investigative, disciplinary, training, and/or policy recommendations. Not always, but usually. Today, we're going to talk about commissions, which consist of appointed and/or elected members of the public, and they're designed to give the public a greater voice in how it's policed. Depending on the jurisdiction, these commissions often possess the power to do more than just make recommendations. They play a role in hiring and firing the police chief. They can develop and actually set departmental policy. They oversee inspector generals and/or independent investigative units and adjudicate allegations of misconduct. They are, though, relatively rare and mainly in big cities. Chicago, which just created a commission this past summer, Detroit, Los Angeles, Milwaukee, Oakland, San Francisco, and St. Louis. This webinar should elucidate the authority and resources these types of commissions possess, how commission members are selected, and how commissions operate. We hope attendees will be able to leverage this information, particularly if you live in an area that is considering creating or strengthening existing civilian oversight structures. And we're lucky to have with us today a national expert on police governance, and leaders of two powerful police commissions in Los Angeles and Oakland. I'm now going to introduce our panelists. Their longer bios are on the website. They have such impressive resumes, I had to shorten it. Professor Maria Ponomarenko is an associate professor of law at the University of Minnesota Law School, where she teaches in the areas of criminal procedure, constitutional law, and administrative law. Her scholarship focuses on police governance and local administrative law. She is also the co-founder and counsel of the Policing Project, a nonprofit based at the New York University School of Law, which works with both police agencies and community groups to promote more effective, just, and accountable policing. In conjunction with the Policing Project, Professor Ponomarenko is spearheading a national effort to develop model legislation on a variety of policing issues. Eileen Decker was appointed to the Los Angeles Board of Police Commissioners in 2018. She currently serves as vice president after serving a 2-year term as president. She teaches law at the University of Southern California Gould School of Law and serves as a Fulbright specialist in cybersecurity law and policy with the Department of State's Bureau of Education and Cultural Affairs. President Obama appointed Ms. Decker as the United States Attorney for the Central District of California, a position she held from 2015 to 2017. And from 2009 to 2015, she worked as the Los Angeles Deputy Mayor for Homeland Security and Public Safety. Prior to her service as Deputy Mayor, Ms. Decker worked for approximately 15 years as an Assistant United States Attorney. Regina Jackson was appointed to the Oakland Police Commission in 2017, and since 2019, she has served as the Commission's chair. For 27 years, Ms. Jackson served as Executive Director and then as President and CEO of the East Oakland Youth Development Center, which develops the social and leadership capacities of youth and young adults aged 6 to 24 to prepare them for employment, higher education, and leadership opportunities. In 2020, she completed a 3-year stint as a fellow in the Robert Woods Johnson Interdisciplinary Research Leaders Program. In addition to her work as a certified professional coach, Ms. Jackson advises a half a dozen nonprofit and educational organizations. This webinar is going to consist of a discussion, and we're going to go through a variety of topics and then open it up for public Q&A. And I'd like to start with the professor. If you could give us a historic and national perspective on police commissions, what their typical powers and characteristics are, and what they can offer communities who want to give the public greater input into how it's policed. And maybe you can make some contrast to some degree with the typical civilian oversight boards that exist throughout the country.
Sure thing. So hi, everyone, and thanks so much for hosting this event and inviting me to participate. So in terms of thinking about commissions, I actually think, civilian review boards are the perfect context or contrast. So, they're both multi-member bodies. They're both made up of members of the public, largely appointed, though in some places elected, and where they differ really is on their mission. So, civilian review boards are what the Policing Project would call back-end entities. So they're focused primarily on allegations of misconduct. So complaints against officers, allegations of excessive force, and what they bring to the table is the kind of civilian perspective in investigating and potentially resolving or reviewing these sorts of complaints after the fact. Commissions, so they sometimes play a role in discipline, including the 2 commissions from whom we have representatives today, but their distinguishing feature is the work that they do on the front end, which is to say in policymaking. So the kind of larger commissions in particular will have authority to actually set policy for the department. They also play a role in hiring, firing police chiefs. And, the LA Commission describes itself as kind of a board of directors for the police department. And in some ways, that's the right way to think about it. So they're the ones who kind of steer the ship. They give the broad policy guidance, and they really kind of bring the public not just into questions of, did a particular officer engage in misconduct, but what should policing look like in the city? What are the policies that need to be in place to make it happen? They review budgets and make these sorts of broader decisions. Now, historically, so commissions are kind of an odd duck. So, the earliest commissions sprung up in the 19-teens and 1920s, not to give the public a greater role in policing, but actually to insulate police chiefs from too much political influence. So, the kind of progressive critique of policing and police management was that, police chiefs came and went with incoming mayors. They were often very susceptible to political pressure. There was rampant corruption. And the idea was to put a kind of non-political, non-partisan group of people in charge of particularly the decision of whether to hire and fire the chief. And so initially the idea was that these commissions would help professionalize policing. They would insulate the chief from kind of the whims that mayors are often much more responsive to, and kind of bring about this era of professionalized policing. There's lots of critique about, why professionalization didn't really address the many concerns of policing. I won't get into it here. But the interesting twist with commissions is that, beginning in the 60s and 80s, there was a resurgent interest in commissions for exactly the opposite reason. It was in response to this notion that police departments had become overly insulated, overly non-responsive to not just political officials, but in particular communities. And the hope with commissions is that giving a broader range of community representatives a kind of voice in policing policy can address some of those pathologies. So when people think about commissions now, it's not as a way to kind of insulate police chiefs from politics, but rather to make policing much more responsive to the communities that are actually being policed. And in terms of the arguments for, commissions and why, and, increasing number of major jurisdictions, Oakland, Los Angeles, Seattle has a commission, though its structure is a little bit different. Now Chicago have really turned to this model as partly a recognition of the limits of back-end accountability. So, it's hugely important to hold officers accountable for misconduct. It's an important role for civilian involvement. The reality is, I'm sure lots of the folks on this webinar know, is you can't hold officers responsible if they're not actually violating policy. And in lots of departments, the problem is with the policy. So the things that people don't like about how policing occurs are either policy deficiencies, decisions about reallocating resources, and choices that you can't really resolve through case-by-case adjudication of misconduct. And so part of what commissions offer is that opportunity to really participate in policymaking, as opposed to just figuring out after the fact whether an officer behaved in a way that was consistent with policies that somebody else set. The other intuition behind commissions, and this is a big part of why I tend to be bullish on these sorts of structures, is it actually puts a set of community members in charge of policing as their core responsibility. So, right now, chiefs in most jurisdictions answer to mayors. Mayors are busy. Mayors are, have incredibly broad portfolios. The kind of oversight that a mayor's office can provide is pretty limited, and it's going to be piecemeal, and it's often very much responsive to crime rates at the expense of everything else. And so, one of the advantages of something like a commission is that it actually, puts a group of people in charge of the police department whose job is to really take that broader lens, and often a group of people who tend to be much more responsive to heavily policed communities in particular than a mayor's office might be. If you think about the classic constituency for a mayor's office, that's not always going to be a constituency whose interests are going to align with those of the more marginalized communities that tend to have better representation on commissions. And then the last thing I'll say, just to set the stage, is commissions have access to information, right? So if we think about, why is it so hard for the public to get the sort of policing that they want? It's because looking from the outside in, it's really hard to figure out exactly what's going wrong on the inside that's generating poor outcomes on the outside. And so what commissions bring to the table, particularly when they're well-resourced, have the support of an inspector general or a kind of broad auditing staff, is that ability to actually figure out in much more granular detail what's going on inside the department that needs to change in order for the things that people see on the outside to start to look different. And so that's the kind of basic intuition behind a commission model. I think it has a lot to do with why we've started to see a lot of major cities, look at that model much more seriously. And I think it speaks really naturally to, what are their core functions? Policy making responsibility, some role in hiring and firing the chief, and then crucially that ability to, access department records, do the sort of broad survey of department policies and practices to inform the exercise of all of those powers. And with that, I'm going to chime down because I'm actually really eager to hear from the two commissioners as well.
I just wanted Commissioner Decker and Chair Jackson, if you could each sort of give a very brief history of how your commission, when it came into existence, and how is it embedded in your city's law. Can we start with the just alphabetically. Commissioner Decker.
Thank you, and good morning from Los Angeles, everyone. We recently discovered that our history goes back farther than we had originally thought. We thought our commission was created in the 1920s. It was actually formed in 1870. Someone uncovered in our archives the statute that created the Los Angeles Police Commission on December 31st, 1870. And the statute gives this commission tremendous powers to appoint, suspend, and discharge all employees in the department, complete control over the police force. And the reason stated in the statute was possibly anticipating hilarious activities in bringing in or during the new year. So apparently the police force was engaging in hilarious activities on New Year's Eve, warranting the creation of this commission. But the commission consisted of effectively the Public Safety Committee on the City Council with oversight by the mayor. So it wasn't an independent body. That independent body came into being in the 1920s, where civilians were appointed, and they had minimal authorities throughout its early history. But the concept of an independent police commission consisting of civilians was developed in the early 1900s in Los Angeles. It really wasn't until the later part of the century where the commission received significant powers to where it is today. And those powers include, as the professor indicated, setting all policy for the department, and oversight of the police chief. The city charter gives us this authority and specifically says that the commission oversees the chief, acts, as you've heard, as a board of directors, can issue instructions to him, can evaluate him on an annual basis, which we do, can appoint and remove him. Both are rather complicated processes, but the commission has that authority. We also oversee the director of the police commission. That's our full-time staff member, the executive director, who runs our daily operations, since commissioners are all volunteers, unpaid appointees. We also have the power to appoint and remove the inspector general. And those three positions, the chief of the police, the executive director, and the inspector general, are the key ways through which the commission exerts its influence over the department. The inspector general being completely independent, conducting investigations and audits, the chief of police, who runs the operations of the department, and the executive director of the commission that helps us manage our work in developing policy and getting information and doing our jobs on a daily basis.
We're going to get into a lot of more detail, your powers and authority. Chair Jackson, could you speak about how the Oakland Commission, which is a lot younger and came into being through a different process? Can you tell us a little bit about your history?
Absolutely, and thank you for having me. Hello and welcome and good morning from Oakland. I would like to share that the commission itself was approved in 2016 by ballot measure that was authorized by 83% of the citizens in Oakland. Prior to that, this was really a community effort. It was community organized through the Coalition for Police Accountability, which has been, since the beginning, probably one of the most learned institutions for helping us navigate this absolutely new and important body of work. So the ballot measure, Measure LL, was approved in November of 2016, and we were actually seated in December of 2017. In terms of our powers, we actually are responsible for overseeing the Oakland Police Department and the Community Police Review Agency, as well as the Office of the Inspector General, for whom we just hired this past January, last month. Within our roles and responsibilities, we ensure policies, practices, customs, and investigations conform to national standards of constitutional policing. With that, our policy provision is final. We approve all appropriate policies. Oftentimes, there are administrative policies that don't need to come to us, but for the most part, we are responsible for all policy approval. In addition, we provide oversight and evaluation, supervision of the the chief of the Oakland Police Department, the executive director of the Community Police Review Agency, as well as the inspector general. With respect to those jobs, we have actually had responsibility for terminating one police chief and then jointly hiring the new chief. So we were responsible for basically the entire interview process, and then we made recommendations of the top 4 candidates to the mayor, and then she was able to do her own interview process and select the final chief. I'd like to say that this entirely volunteer effort, particularly as it relates to the Oakland Police Department's chief, because we did it all internally on our own, we saved the city over $1 million. That's a really good showing as it relates to volunteer efforts, because we all have jobs outside of this job. So I think that covers all of the critical points. I know we'll get into more details later, but please let me know if I've missed something.
Yeah, wasn't there a 2020 ballot measure in Oakland that expanded the commission's authority?
Okay.
What was, did that create the IG? Am I remembering it correctly?
Okay, I appreciate you mentioning that. I certainly forgot Measure S1, which was approved by over 73% of the citizens. So the language, as you can well imagine, in ballot measures, especially when you're doing the first thing, seemed to be a little unclear. And so the city attorney's office issued an opinion on 2 major points. And that was, one, that we have the opportunity to have independent legal counsel. And the second part was the point that you're making. And because they had opined on that during the 2017-2018 period of time, we had to develop another ballot measure that clarified beyond a shadow of a doubt that those 2 powers were in fact in the House of the Commission. So it's unfortunate that we had to wait so long to be able to do the hiring of the Inspector General, and it was absolutely critical that we had our own independent legal counsel from the city.
Okay. Professor, did you want to add anything about how these types of police management or oversight structures are created generally? I mean, there are not that many, but I know that you just work pretty extensively with the city of Chicago.
Yeah, I mean, I think that for the more recent commissions, the story looks a lot like the one that Chair Jackson described, which is, there's, in Chicago in particular, there's a big push from grassroots advocates, really going back to just after the murder of Laquan McDonald, for the sort of broader oversight. And it's led to the creation of the Inspector General's office, a much more active and powerful civilian oversight entity, and now this kind of third layer, which is the police commission. And so I think for the newer ones, it's usually a grassroots effort, and it's usually in response to this perception that there's no other way for community members to really kind of have their voice heard when it comes to policy issues.
Commissioner Decker and Chair Jackson, you both touched a little bit on the relationship between your commissions and the police chief. If you could detail a little bit more about your commission's role in hiring or firing the chief, what the reporting lines are, how the mayor is involved in the reporting, and whether you're required to evaluate the chief's performance, that sort of thing. Chair Jackson.
Thank you for that question. So in terms of supervisorial responsibility, the chair is, the chief is actually split in about 3 or 4 places. So he in fact reports to us. He also reports to the mayor. He also reports to the federal monitor. And maybe some kind of a dotted line to the city administrator. I know that when we redesigned the job description, we went totally off script in terms of innovating. We pretty much said he needed to walk on water because we recognized that that's a lot of responsibility in addition to providing direction to a 1,000-member agency. We are responsible for evaluating him, and as a part of Measure LL, the evaluative properties had to do with, the design, and then you get to review a year after the design is complete. So our design is complete. Well, it'll be complete in about a week, and then we will be able to move forward on an evaluative process. I do meet with him once weekly. I provide feedback, insight, oversight. I have participated in interviews for community police review officers and lieutenant promotions, whatever it is that he asks for my kind of managerial astuteness on, I'm happy to support him in. We do talk about significant challenges, and I listen to his thought process going forward, and he in fact is much more community oriented in terms of recognizing the need for a change in culture inside OPD, and is very committed to both that and that of helping us get out of the NSA, the negotiated settlement agreement. Short of that,
Hiring and firing, yeah.
yes, and so we did terminate a police chief back in 2016, and so we do have termination privileges for cause. During that particular termination, we actually had the mayor join us in a no cause termination. So there are some limitations, but that is how we chose to pursue that particular situation.
And in terms of hiring, do you, I indicated you put out the job notice and interviewed candidates, and do you submit candidates to the mayor for appointment, or who actually appoints the chief in Oakland?
Yes, so we submitted 4 candidates for her review and approval, and she did select one of the top candidates in our recommendation list.
How does that process work in Los Angeles, Commissioner Decker?
Well, before 1992, it was really the complete jurisdiction of the commission. The personnel department would pick a group of civilians who would do the first cut of all the individuals who applied, do some interviews, but pass all qualified candidates to the commission, who would then do the interview and hiring process. The mayor and the city council were not involved in that process at all. As a result of charter change in the 1990s, the process did change to incorporate the mayor and city council, because the city noticed, without the mayor having direct oversight in some form over a police chief, there were a lot of disagreements in the city, and the chief of police became too powerful as an independent individual. And so now the system works that the commission still has a significant role in hiring, but the personnel department looks at all the applicants and does pass the qualified ones to the commission. The commission does all the interviewing, reviewing of histories, backgrounds, and then selects 3 candidates, rates them in preferential order, and passes those to the mayor, who then selects who the next chief will be, and the city council has to confirm the chief. So all significant parts of the city, the elected officials and the commission have a role in the selection of the chief. In terms of termination, the commission can terminate a chief at any time, and we are to notify the mayor when we make that decision. And of course, as a practical matter, it wouldn't be just a call out of the blue. There would be conversations ahead of time, but under the city charter, we have to notify the mayor of our intent. The city council has a certain number of days in which they can intervene if they choose to do so. And if they do not intervene, the mayor has an option of intervening. But that process has, under the new charter, never been activated. That's how a chief would be terminated. In terms of our oversight of the chief, as president and vice president of the commission, we meet with the chief frequently, multiple times a week, sometimes calls frequently during the week, in order to discuss major issues that are happening, promotions within the department, audits that we think need to be done outside of the inspector general, and just on a variety of things, personnel issues that perhaps are happening. We are very engaged, and our police chief keeps us very engaged. It's a good working relationship. That's how you want it to be, so that you're not just speaking to each other when a problem arises.
Do you formally evaluate the chief?
Yes, annually. We do evaluate him. It's a rather extensive process. All 5 commissioners are involved in that process. Typically, it's around the time of July 1st, our fiscal year in the city of Los Angeles. We review him. It's a detailed written report to him. He has an opportunity to present us information in advance. The commission typically has several meetings, ultimately resulting in a written annual evaluation that is frequently tied to whether or not he gets a raise, and that process is a little complicated. Frequently also depends on whether this city has resources, and not just on performance, but we not only evaluate him, but determine whether or not he gets a raise in any given year.
Professor, anything you want to add on this report, the police chief across the country with respect to commissions and the relationship between the commission and the chief?
I mean, I think the 2 commissioners have actually more or less covered it. I think this dual structure tends to be pretty typical for precisely the reasons that, Commissioner Decker outlined. We want some sort of mayoral control over the hiring and firing of the chief, but this kind of dual ability to either, recommend candidates or fire after the fact is pretty typical of kind of most commission structures.
Right, and I know that was embedded in the Chicago ordinance too, with, of course, various nuances for each city. You mentioned in your initial remarks, Professor, the importance in policymaking in these commissions, and how most oversight involves back-end accountability, and making policy is really what the policing project calls front-end accountability. Could Commissioner Decker and Chair Jackson, you mentioned earlier that you guys have final say over policy. What is it for all police department policies, or just a subgroup of policies? What, if anything, does your commission do generally to obtain public input into the policy-making process, whether it's on new or revised policies? And is it your commission who has final decision-making on new and revised policies, and how does that work? Let's start with Commissioner Decker.
Thank you. So our commission, the Los Angeles Commission, makes the decision on all policies. And policies can emanate from a number of different sources. They can come from the department, they can emanate from the commission, seeing a pattern, as the professor indicated. Sometimes in evaluating use of force cases, we see issues and we want to see what the policy is, and we realize maybe the policy needs to be updated. So it can come from the department, the commission, the inspector general reports that we rely on heavily. The inspector general frequently is asked or recommends that his office engage in investigations that result in a report, and or an audit, investigation or audit, as to practices that are happening. And frequently he may recommend policies be implemented. And policies also can come from the community when we hear community concerns on a particular issue. I think the commission is always looking in its role as oversight as to what policies need to take place. Oh, and I should add also state law. Sometimes state law changes and we have to update our policies to be consistent with law. So we're always looking at these policies in terms of consistency with state law, issues that the Inspector General may bring to our attention, issues the public may bring to our attention, and issues that we as commissioners see either from our oversight of the use of force cases that we see, or just our general oversight in being engaged in department activities. All commissioners on the Board of Police Commission are also on subcommittees where we dive into different issues, such as 2 commissioners work on training and learning everything about the training program to see whether there are any issues, but also just to be informed about it. We have 2 commissioners who work on use of force cases and use of force policy. So these issues and policies are always being evaluated on a constant basis. But it is the Board of Police Commissioners in Los Angeles that makes a decision on all policies, no matter where they come from. Typically, we post the policy as we must do under the Brown Act in California, and we post it on a Friday. Our hearing is the next Tuesday, and typically we allow a 2-week period before we vote to allow more public to come forward. But in many of the bigger policies, we've heard a matter, say, from an Inspector General's report, and we indicate that the policy is going to be prepared, and anyone who wants to present their thoughts can do so. While we work on the policy, we're getting public comment at the same time. So the development of policy can happen in a variety of different ways. The bigger issues and the bigger development of policies typically happen over the course of months, starting perhaps with an Inspector General's report, the development of policy, the presentation of the first draft, public comment period, revisions, and then a vote by the commission.
Chair Jackson.
Yes, thank you. In terms of the way the commission manages its policies, we are able to review all policies. But because there are over 150 that are at least 10 years old, we try to create some efficient mechanisms for addressing those that are most important or most challenging. And so in terms of, this division of labor for 7 regular commissioners and 2 alternates, we learned the hard way that standing committees probably weren't the way to get that work done. So we began creating ad hoc committees, and they move around based upon what the subject matter is, either their interest or their expertise. And so what we have done over the years, like the use of force, that particular policy took about 9 months, working with the Oakland Police Department, as well as some community people that served on that ad hoc. And so what we try to do is create the majority of work in possibly like a one-way listening feed for community should they decide to listen in, to also allow for community members to be directly involved in the ad hocs, identifying language, subject matter experts, because in many of the instances we will also create subject-specific forums to really put the policy that we think is just about there under a magnifying light to see if there is any other additional gaps that are necessary, and that may either come from community voice or some of those subject matter experts. With respect to our own approach to policy, because so many are so old, they are really being fine-tuned pretty much from the beginning. And we have federal monitor reports that highlight certain weaknesses. Policies also are able to come from the community, and we take a look at the Community Police Review Agency and what challenges they're having with investigations as it relates to policies, to take a look at what might need to be modernized, updated, to kind of comport with community expectation in addition to anything else. And like I said, our OIG is very, very new, so we haven't had that much experience there. And in terms of some state laws, we in fact are taking a look at how to work with our fellow state politicians to affect some change. In this instance, like perhaps expanding the POBAR exclusion of 1 year. And so we're trying to be as modernized, as efficient, and as thoughtful as possible.
I know I'm cognizant of time, but who does your work for you in terms of researching best practices with respect to certain policies that you're evaluating?
So we have been doing our work. We just got a chief of staff in August. And with the OIG coming on board, she will have more policy analytical work, but the chief of staff, one person, has been providing us a lot of research. We hope to expand by bringing on some fellows, and our budget is going to increase fairly substantially in July with the start of the new fiscal year. So it's been a grind, but we've been doing some outstanding work because this is our second full-time job for the most of us.
Yeah, I'm going to get to the composition a little bit later on. What about in LA? Do you have you said you have an executive director. Do you also rely on the IG staff, or?
So we do our policy research in a number of different ways, and it really depends on the issue. First, the Inspector General's office is a group of extremely dedicated professional individuals for whom we rely on tremendously for information. We also do our own independent research, depending again on the issue. In many cases, we ask the department to do a public report on best practices throughout the nation on a certain topic. Our executive director typically doesn't do our research on policy, although we can ask him to. He is an incredibly knowledgeable individual and has been in his position for a number of years. He helps us with a variety of things, but he also manages a staff and has numerous other responsibilities. So we try to moderate that a little bit, but we get a lot of our information from the department, where we request public reports on best practices throughout the nation, the Inspector General, and we do independent research as well.
So, do you want to comment further on this topic, Professor?
Nope, I think they have it covered.
You both mentioned that you oversee other entities that in some other cities are independent civilian oversight agencies. I don't want to spend that much time on them because NACOL has spent a lot of time on this topic, but I just want to confirm that in LA, the Board of Police Commissioners oversees the LA PD IG, Inspector General, and is responsible for hiring that person. And in Oakland, you oversee the Community Police Review Agency, which is an independent investigative body, and you're now overseeing an IG. Is there anything I'm missing in either of your jurisdictions?
No, I think that you have captured it well. I think the one thing that I would add is that as an entity that has been under a negotiated settlement agreement for almost 2 decades, what we are expecting our IG to do is set up the office so that once we are out of that NSA agreement, that she can then be the oversight body that is doing the work currently done by the federal monitor.
Understood. I think our audience would be interested in the role that your commissions play in adjudicating alleged misconduct cases. Commissioner Decker, if you could, and this includes both administrative finding, like whether conduct was within or without policy, and what, if any, role your commission plays in recommending or actually making a disciplinary decision. Yes,
Okay.
Decker.
Thank you. Yes, so the Los Angeles Police Commission oversees the decision with respect to all what we call categorical use of force cases. And as we define it effectively, and I hope I'm not being overly simplistic in it, it's wherever an individual is injured in the encounter with an officer. It's also all use of a firearm, whether, so it would include, for example, unintentional discharges as well. Instances of a lower use of force where an individual is not injured is not something that we play a role in overseeing. Those we call non-categorical. Those are handled at a local level. We do, however, have the Inspector General do reports on the implementation, the oversight and implementation of discipline in those cases. But we directly the categorical use of force, the more significant use of force, oversee the cases where we the cases typically 10 months after the incident, and during that time there's an in-depth investigation conducted by the department, overseen by the Office of Inspector General. There is an internal hearing in the department as to what they're going to recommend to the Chief of Police. And then when we go into our closed session to review these matters, we hear the presentation of the evidence collected during the investigation. We get the Chief of Police's recommendation. We get the Inspector General's recommendation. And then we decide whether the officer involved acted within or out of policy, the policies that we developed in the past. With respect to the discipline that is imposed, we have effectively no role. The charter provides that authority with the Chief of Police. I will say from time to time, the Chief of Police will say, what do you think about this case? Or he will also indicate to us repeatedly, I'm interested in your thoughts. But we have no binding authority. We have no authority over that other than the chief agreeing. There is an appellate process involved. It's very complicated, and that's one of the issues perhaps we'll talk about later, where an officer who's unsatisfied with the finding or the discipline can go to what's a Board of Rights. The commission does hire those hearing officers that sit on the Board of Rights, but we do not influence them in their decision or get involved in their decision in any way.
Thank you. And Chair Jackson, your commission actually oversees the CPRA. Again, that's the Community Police Review Agency that does independent investigations. They're not IAB investigations. Tell us what role your commission plays in actually making the findings and or imposing discipline.
Yes, thank you. Our role is a bit smaller than Commissioner Decker's. So as the OPD IAD office is doing their investigation, you have the CPRA, Community Police Review Agency, doing an aligned investigation. When they disagree on discipline, that is when it gets kicked up to the commission. And then we will call for a discipline committee and we will make the recommendation. So we terminated 5 officers back in 2018 based upon one of those cases. And then we also made recommendation for the supervisor to have discipline as well. And while we have not had many discipline committees, we've had a few. But we are the final say for that. Now, with any police discipline, there are like 17 different steps that you have to go through to actually ensure that they stay terminated. I don't really mean 17, but there's about 4, and they are elongated and take years.
Right.
So I'm happy to say that once we have our discipline committee, which is usually a group of 3 commissioners, combing through hundreds and thousands of documents to determine, and video, to determine that we are the most informed, since we are the final say. It's an extraordinary responsibility, and I'm glad we haven't had to do it very often. It's cumbersome for people with full-time jobs, but we accept that responsibility and intend to do a lot of that work on the weekends.
So in essence, Professor, these commissions have both front-end accountability and some back-end accountability. Is that common? Or how do they square up with the other commissions that you're familiar with across the country?
It tends to be, though, I mean, first of all, there's only 6 commissions now, with Chicago 7, that have policy setting authority. And so we're talking about a very small number, and that's of the major cities. I mean, there's a scattered number of kind of teeny tiny commissions in little towns on the East Coast in particular. But yeah, so a number of the other commissions have some role in the disciplinary process. San Francisco also has, some disciplinary oversight authority. I mean, as Commissioner Jackson points out, the concern is, I think it's an important role for commissions to play. It is hugely resource intensive, and I get the sense that that's the experience in LA as well. Each of these cases take up a potentially huge amount of time, and so, as cities are thinking about what precise role a commission should have in discipline, I think if there is any kind of concern, it's just that resource piece, which is the time that's spent on discipline is time that's not spent on policymaking, more systemic oversight, but most find some way to kind of split that difference and give the commission at least a partial role.
We've talked a little bit. I'm going to move into a different topic, commission composition and selection process. If you could review with us the number of commissioners you have, how they're selected, meaning are they elected, are they nominated, who appoints them, who has to confirm them, are there identity or experiential exclusions or mandatory inclusions, the terms and term limits, conditions for removal. Chair Jackson has made reference several times to the fact that it's volunteer in Oakland, whether there's any remuneration. Start with Commissioner Decker.
Well, thank you. There are 5 commissioners in Los Angeles, all selected by the mayor, nominated by the mayor, confirmed by the city council. There are no inclusion or exclusion criteria in the city charter. The mayor, I can say, looks for diversity and also diversity of experiences in bringing people to the commission. I'm the only former federal prosecutor, the only one who's worked with law enforcement, but also prosecuted them. And the other commissioners bring different experiences, community organizing, business background. There's a lot of different diversity of ideas on our commission. Our term limits are 2 5-year terms. They are staggered, so every year a commissioner is up for a reappointment, and you can serve, just as I said, the maximum of 2 5-year terms for a total of 10 years. It is rare that anyone achieves that 10-year marker, in part because it is a volunteer job and it is very time intensive, but that is the maximum period. We did, in my memory, have 1 person who served the full 10 years who ended recently, and I think next year one of our commissioners next year in 2023 will one of our current commissioners will achieve that 10-year marker. Very rare. It is a volunteer position, as I mentioned, similar to Commissioner Jackson. And our time commitment is extensive depending on the agenda each week. I would say minimum 20 hours a week, but in most weeks, and particularly when I was president, it was 40, 50 hours or more a week. The mayor doesn't tell people that when they agree to sign up. It's going to be a lot, but I don't think most people understand the commitment. As Commissioner Jackson talked about, our closed sessions where we hear these cases every single Tuesday, we get thousands of documents. We get all the underlying reports, witness statements, officer statements, forensics analysis. We get an enormous amount of material, very important material that we have to read and be prepared for on Tuesday. So it is a solemn responsibility that I think everyone does take seriously, but it is an enormous commitment, particularly when serving as president and you're the focal point for the department in getting the commission engaged on anything, but also for your fellow commissioners. So it is a big responsibility with relatively little staff compared to the responsibility.
Chair Jackson.
Yes, thank you. So we have a commission of 7 people with 2 alternates. So the 7 are made up of 3 from the mayor's office. She will nominate. There is 1 requirement in Measure LL that one of those people either be a judge or be an attorney with criminal defense experience. But those are the only requirements for the mayor's nominees. The other 4 entities are selected by a selection committee of community people. you can, many of the even mayoral selections have gone through the selection committee process as well. It's an exceptionally long vetting process, but we get community people, teachers, lawyers, principals, things like that, and because we are all, for the most part, with the exception maybe of that judge or criminal defense person, very new, trainings are exceedingly important. I will say that while we don't review investigations in closed session on a weekly basis, like Commissioner Decker mentioned, we do try to do from time to time, and we're actually going to increase the consistency of a deep dive into investigations once they have actually been completed, to understand not just the process, but how policy impacts the work, to really try and get a investigative lens, if you will, on the actual investigation. As it relates to commissioner timelines, initially when we started, there were 2, 3, and 4-year staggered terms. Now everybody is at a 3-year term, although because of the way they went on, it stays staggered. I am actually, I just completed my 4-year term, and I'm in a holdover position because I am still chair. I wanted to make a commitment to helping to support the capacity of the commissioners, facilitating the transition to new leadership, because as a 4-year term member, I have all of the historical knowledge, all the institutional knowledge, because everybody has transitioned off. Now, the mayor has offered me an opportunity to be reappointed. I have resisted that because of Commissioner Decker and my explanation of how much of a commitment it is. That said, the selection committee has actually never reappointed somebody from their shop. We're hoping to, well, I'm hoping to have a conversation with them about, a 2-pronged process whereby there's a separate process to consider renewals versus everybody just kind of competing straight out of the gate. I hope I have addressed all your questions.
Yeah, on your commissions, are people with previous law enforcement experience excluded from serving on the commission, or is the statute silent on that?
Yeah, so they are excluded from serving if they have been inside OPD. We have not had the challenge yet to have somebody apply or be nominated from outside of a policing entity, but I would say it would be frowned upon, quite frankly. And I think that has as much to do with the activist, independent, and very community-oriented process that both go through. I mean, I am a community leader and the mayor appointed me. The mayor also, when she's looking to make new nominations, does invite us to interview the candidates that she's considering, and we give her feedback. And I think in all instances, she's taken that feedback. So it's not just I've got a great idea or I know a great person. She is very interested in making sure that the vetting process is pretty thorough and that there's going to be a good fit.
Can commissioners be removed for anything other than cause in either city?
They can be removed for conduct. We have not had that scenario thus far. And I do believe that the commission could make the recommendation. I believe that the city council, who ultimately affirms our positions, it will be the one to take that final step. But it hasn't happened thus yet.
In Los Angeles, commissioners can be removed at any time for any reason by the mayor.
Professor, I know Chicago is the newest of these types of commissions, and there's fairly extensive experiential and requirements that are, and requirement that 2 people be on this new commission be young, Maybe can you tell us a little bit about how you know they get paid a little bit in Chicago. The chair is going to get $15,000 a year, and a commissioner is going to get 12. Maybe you can just briefly touch on some aspects of the Chicago Commission and their selection process that is kind of unique.
Sure. So, Chicago, I think, was trying to solve for a problem that is typical of all commissions, which is how do you get a commission that is somewhat accountable to the political process without replicating all of the dysfunctions in the political process that have led to the kind of policing that we have today. And I think Chicago, it'll come as no surprise to anyone, has had a little bit of a dysfunctional mayoral system, and there's not a lot of faith in the city that having a commission that's kind of exclusively accountable to the mayor and chosen exclusively by the mayor would actually fundamentally change policing in the way that residents want to see. And so a big part of the puzzle in Chicago was how to create a selection mechanism that really broadened the range of voices that would be on the commission. And they've essentially done it in two ways. So one is with some limited number of experiential requirements. So some number of candidates have to be younger, have backgrounds that are going to make it a little bit more likely that they're going to be responsive to more marginalized, more heavily policed communities and bring that different perspective to bear. And then the other more unique feature of Chicago is, so they've created this kind of parallel structure of what are called district councils. So Chicago is broken up into, I want to say it's 22 police districts. And in every one of these districts, there's going to be a local level election. There's already an infrastructure for it. It's how they elect the PTA boards at different schools. But there's going to be, hyper local elections to select community members to sit on district councils to provide kind of district level input and oversight. And then these district representatives are going to play a role in nominating potential candidates for the commission itself. And so the idea is that, particularly in, given Chicago, it's very segregated, very geographically dispersed. And so there'll be representatives from, the South Side, the West Side, where you have, the much heavier police presence, playing a much more active role in that selection process so that it's not a process that's just dominated kind of exclusively by the mayor. The mayor is going to have the ultimate say, but it's going to be based on nominations from the district council representatives.
Thank you. I just want to talk a little bit about your resources. All of you have sort of made reference to commission resources. I noticed in the Chicago ordinance, there's actually statutory minimum put in the statute that says that the Chicago Commission's budget has to be a certain percentage of a different, I think the police department budget. But if you could speak to what your budgets are, you talked a little bit about staff. And Chair Jackson, you mentioned you have independent legal counsel, what your access to police department records are there any issues there? Like a lot of typical civilian oversight entities have tremendous obstacles in obtaining records. And what if any training is required for commission members, or how do you get training? Who provides it? Chair Jackson.
Okay, that was a mouthful. So first off, our budget combined is $4.5 million, but it will move up to $6 million at the start of the next fiscal year based upon our needing to staff the Inspector General's office. In addition, one of the many reasons that we want to get out of the negotiated settlement agreement, separate and apart from the fact that it will, determine that we are not under this this stronghold and this curious eye from federal, is that the federal monitor makes $1.2 million each year for doing his job. We'd like to see that money come back to our budget. As it relates to staffing, we at the commission have very limited staffing, but are looking to increase that as well. And of course, I've lost your other, police training, police commission training. So we would actually like to see more trainings like what police officers get in order to kind of compare and contrast. Because of the timing, we did quite a few trainings. There's a long list with the city attorney's office. And then, of course, it went online when we went into the pandemic. But I would like to see more community trainings. That said, there are a certain number and a certain amount of specified trainings that one must do before they can be approved to sit on a discipline committee. I'm sure that I just missed one of the other components, Florence, I'm sorry.
That's okay. Commissioner Decker.
So in Los Angeles, we do not have an independent budget. Our budget is part of the Los Angeles Police Department, and I think that is because historically, when there have been inspector generals, much like in the federal government, they're part of that department, even though they're an independent agency within it. But we do have what's in city budget speak, authorities. Those are the positions that are allowed to be filled. So we do have a robust, although I know if our inspector general's on board or listening, he would like more people, but it's an office where he has 36 positions he can fill. I think right now 32 are filled. There's inevitable turnover. We do have our executive director, as I spoke of. The commission does have a staff of individuals who are actually assigned specific duties that the city had, again, historically given the commission, like oversight of permits, and that the commission has always had those authorities. So they're not working really on what you might call oversight, particular jobs, but it is a function that just historically has been with the commission. But we don't have an independent budget that we manage or control. It's a problem, I suppose, in many ways, but I will say that when we need something, we talk to the chief, the mayor, or the city council, and we usually do get it. But we are embedded in the police department budget.
I wanted to know if you could describe your relationship with the community. How often do you have public meetings? How frequently? Well, that's the same question. How often do you have public meetings? How long do they typically last? What, if any, how transparent are you with respect to your website? Do you have staff that's dedicated to reaching out to the public? I'll go back to Commissioner Decker.
We meet publicly once a week. Every Tuesday, we have a public meeting that is very structured under the Brown Act. It really doesn't offer the opportunity for back and forth. There's rules we have to follow, but we do meet publicly every single Tuesday. I would say, on average, 3 of the 4 Tuesdays each month. The meetings are 5 or 6 hours long, although a portion of that is our closed session where we hear all the use of force cases. Outside of the meetings, we commissioners, all of us, even during the pandemic, have made tremendous efforts to be out in the community, to meet with different groups, and also to meet with police officers as well. I think all the commissioners have been to all 21 divisions, but more than that, community meetings that are not organized by the police department as well. We make a real effort to get to our Human Relations Commission in the city Civil Rights Department, help in organizing smaller community meetings where we get to meet with a lot of different groups. I think I answered all your questions.
Okay, and yes, Chair Jackson.
You're so good, Commissioner Decker. So for us, we our meeting length is similar, 5 to 6 hours. I was getting some real pushback from the auditor on that's just too long a meeting, but we had a lot to do. Our meetings are the 2nd and 4th Thursdays. There have been over the last couple of years that we have had weekly meetings for specific subject matters, special forums or budget meetings. So fortunately for me, my commissioners are pretty flexible in meeting as often as I think we need to. In terms of community work, because I am a community leader, I wear a double hat. So I'm not exactly sure how often my fellow commissioners are able to get out to the community. However, there are quite a few different kinds of meetings as opposed to events that do happen that many of my fellow commissioners are happy to sit in on or facilitate. In terms of community engagement, regular community engagement, we do not have staff to facilitate that in any of the 3 areas that we are responsible for. We are hoping to change some of that, or at least bring those put those responsibilities in someone's shop as a part of policy making, or as a part of investigative responsibility, because the real only way that community gets to see and know what we're doing in terms of keeping it transparent is the public comment. It's the forums that we put on. It's the one-way listening into meetings if they are not in fact in the meetings. And we have an extraordinary responsibility to educate the community on how these processes go. But we are still kind of far behind in terms of aligning policies and procedures to kind of comport with what the community's expectations are. So it's an uphill climb, but we're continuing to try and close gaps all the time.
So before we open it up to public comment, I had a couple more questions. Professor, we've been talking about big cities and their commissions that wield a significant amount of power and authority and consume, notwithstanding the fact that they're volunteer, a considerable amount of resources. Could you provide your thoughts on what jurisdictions outside of large cities can do in terms of improving their police governance and giving the public a greater voice in how it's policed?
Sure. So, I'm a little conflicted on whether commissions are the right model outside the major cities, in part because I am skeptical that without that kind of time commitment and the resources, it's really possible to make a major dent. A smaller police department may be slightly easier to manage in terms of, the workload, but it's not proportional. It's not like there's a linear relationship. And so, you can get away with just working, 1 or 2 hours a week if the department is considerably smaller. The questions that arise still require the same amount of thoughtfulness and research and focus on the part of commissioners as they would in a larger commission. And so, for smaller jurisdictions, I think there's a variety of models, and we've seen them in a lot of smaller places. So, inspector generals or auditors are, I think, one really critical piece that's a lot easier of a lift for a smaller jurisdiction. The big thing that at least reasonably resourced auditor can bring is surfacing issues, right? So even if they don't have binding authority, to the extent that they have the authority to, really audit department practices, identify problems where they exist, they can inform that policymaking process. Other smaller jurisdictions have, kind of more ad hoc bodies. So one thing that may work really well in a smaller jurisdiction is, when there is a critical incident, and I don't mean just a shooting, but, when something goes wrong, bring together a group of community members for 1 year, 2 years to really kind of give them that focused authority to look at the problem holistically, figure out what are all the things that can be changed, but then let people go back to their lives. I think sustaining a vigorous commission may be hard, but these sort of ad hoc processes, and we've seen them in places like Sacramento and Grand Rapids, where you can have sustained attention for a little while and make a pretty powerful impact. And so I think those are some ideas, but it's definitely a lot harder in a place that just doesn't have the staffing and the resources that the larger cities can bring to bear.
Thank you. I have other questions, but I'm going to turn it over to Cami and our audience. Cami, yeah, here we are.
Hi, Flo. Thank you. And thank you so much for the information so far and the perspectives. But we do have quite a few questions from our audience members. And the first one is for you, Chair Jackson. So can you clarify the difference in the roles of the Oakland Inspector General and the Community Police Review Agency?
Certainly. So the Oakland Inspector General is aligned with the police department's practices and policies. And so they're doing an internal investigation, whereas the Community Police Review Agency is an entirely separate entity doing their own investigations, interviews. Sometimes they'll do interviews together because of the Santa Ana law, but they come to their conclusions. And then, as I mentioned, when discipline recommendations are made, it is when they disagree that it bubbles up to the commission for a final determination. But one is internal and one is very much external. There are different timelines for investigations to be completed. I'm sorry. And I think that's probably the biggest of the alignments, is that IAD is reporting to the chief of police, whereas Community Police Review Agency is reporting to the Police Commission. I hope that's helpful.
Yeah.
The Inspector General reports to you, the Oakland Police Commission, right?
Yes, ma'am. And like I said, she has been in her job about 5 minutes, 4 whole weeks. And so we look forward to seeing how that role will work, particularly as she audits and provides oversight to investigations in both camps.
Wonderful. Thank you for that, Chair Jackson. The next question is actually for both Commissioner Decker and Chair Jackson. So where there are multiple oversight entities with the power to influence police, such as commissions, IGs, investigative agencies, and the department itself, which entity takes the lead and how are conflicts resolved? Commissioner Decker, would you like to start?
Sure. Well, each entity has its very distinct role. So for example, if the department is investigating an issue, say a use of force, the Inspector General is doing his own independent review of that incident. And we get both reports. They come to us. And now if there's a disagreement, that disagreement is brought to the commission, and ultimately we make the decision when it comes to, say, a use of force case. When the Inspector General is doing an audit of practices within the department, typically the Inspector General does share a draft of what the findings and recommendations will be to the department to get their feedback. So by the time it comes to the commission in a public forum, the department has had a chance to comment. Frequently, they adopt all the recommendations, but if there's a difference of an opinion, they communicate with one another so that the Inspector General can be sure he has all the correct facts necessary to present to the commission. But ultimately, if there's a disagreement, he puts in his report his independent analysis of what he found, and the department, if they disagree with that, can counter with their own response to the Inspector General's report, and the commission then will decide in what direction it's going to go.
Thank you, Commissioner. Chair Jackson, do you have anything to add to that?
Yes, actually, since the Inspector General has been on board, we actually made an observation that we decided to change, and that is that the Community Police Review Agency, while they are entitled to certain kinds of information from the internal investigative work, they had previously been receiving the full investigation. And we actually thought that that was not fully independent. And so we just put an end to that, so that there is a total transparent window and full independence for the responsibility of the Community Police Review Agency to ensure that it is reflecting the best and most for the benefit of community. So as as an external entity, being a volunteer entity, there are only so many things that you can know. And so having someone who comes from that world and is now internal in that particular bird's nest, she can make recommendations or observations that we might not have even been aware of or known to ask that question, right? And so I think that there are likely to be other recommendations on the horizon which will both help and evolve the two entities. Now, I will say one more piece. As a part of reimagining public safety, which was almost a year-long work that happened last year, there was a recommendation for IAD to be moved to the CPRA. We have not yet let the RFP, I'm sorry with all these acronyms, for a consultant to help design how that goes. But what we want to ensure is that the Community Police Review Agency is operating at its highest efficiency and effectiveness before we go, break that model up, right? And conflate the IAD as well. So that's further down the road if in fact it happens.
Thank you for that. Our next question is for you, Professor Ponomarenko. Is there any empirical evidence about the relative effectiveness? I'm pretty sure this comes up every time you speak, doesn't it? Of front-end accountability versus back-end accountability. Relatedly, do we know anything about how commissions impact community relationships with the police department?
Yeah, so the short answer is there's not empirical evidence, and if you think about it, it's really easy to see why. So partly, commissions come into being at moments of great change in departments generally. So if you look at a place like Chicago, they get refurbished civilian oversight entity, they get a new inspector general, they get a new commission while under a monitorship, under the supervision of the state, with 27,000 other things that are happening at the same time, rising crime. And so even if you could think about what are the right metrics to measure, there's so many things that are changing at once that you're never going to be able to say had it not been for the commission, the use of force rates would have been X% higher. There's ways that we could think about what commissions bring to the table in a more kind of qualitative way. So you can look at the sorts of policy issues that commissions have taken up that we haven't traditionally seen departments pay a lot of attention to in places that don't have commissions. You can look for places where commissions might disagree with the chief and the commission's policy preference prevails. So, my sense is, for example, around body cameras, there are certain things that the police commission ended up adopting that I'm probably unlikely that you would have seen that had the police department been setting its own policy, especially around the release of video, which was a process that we helped with. And so you can kind of point to specific areas where having front end kind of oversight pushes policies in directions that they might not otherwise. But in terms of, empirical evidence, it's a long-term project for me to try to figure out how to come up with it, but the confounding kind of variable problem, if you will, just makes it really, really hard to say anything definitive.
Thank you so much for that. The next question is for you, Chair Jackson. We have quite a few people actually today joining us from Chicago. And one of the questions is, what was the most challenging obstacle to getting the new commission up and running? And how would you advise the folks in Chicago to avoid some of those challenges?
I think perhaps the selection committee process was one of the most challenging. I think whenever you're trying to create your own blueprint, it takes more time to figure out how you're going to move forward, and then you have to look in the rearview mirror to figure out whether or not it was effective, right? Mm-hmm. So there are a lot of commissions out there where the mayor appoints everybody, and it was very important to the community that they have more votes than the mayor, because there's often a power struggle, perceived or real, that is included there. But I will say this, that once we all got on board, there was still not a bunch of capacity made available by the city structures. So if, we didn't have an email when we showed up, we didn't have a phone number, we didn't have admin. So, the first big push was actually getting the ballot approved. Then the next big push was getting the people. Then the next big push was getting the platform or the capacity. And then the next big push was actually allowing us to be productive, because most of us were not subject matter experts, and maybe had very little engagement, with policing. Now, we did have a couple of commissioners who actually had been system involved. So that has actually been of great support, because you have a perspective that's very, very different. And if we can be of assistance with any other questions after this, please just email me. Maybe you can put that in the chat, Florence, I don't know.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. I think we have time for one more question, Flo. Yes?
Sure, yes.
Okay. The next one is one that does come up often when we're talking about civilian oversight. Do you, sorry, they're coming in fast enough that I'm losing the ones at the top. So have you, how have police organizations and unions impacted your commissions?
I'll try to be quick. So I meet with the OPOA at least once a year, sometimes more. One of the things that we've been dealing with is attrition, and they've been uniquely concerned about that. So have we. We keep a communication line open, identifying what the information from the exit interviews are saying. But in addition, it's really important to have conversations so that people aren't just, clutching everything like you're trying to take it all from us, right? And so to the extent that there is a respect around leadership and some transparency, I think that there is a trust factor that allows for benefit of the doubt sometimes. I think that's exceedingly important. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Chair. Commissioner Decker?
With respect to Los Angeles, we are a neutral body, right? The commission and commissioners individually meet with members of the union, have conversations with them, but I think most commissioners take an active role in remaining neutral, hearing from them. They call into our police commission meetings like other members of the public, and we hear from them. They write when policy is coming forward. They also provide written public comment, but we do meet with officers, not necessarily the union. I'd say the commissioners mostly meet with officers when they go to the different divisions, but the president of the commission does have meetings from time to time with the union leadership on significant matters that arise from time to time, but it's a balance between remaining neutral and independent and meeting. So we try to strive for that balance, but not, we're not closing doors on any communications either.
Wonderful.
But
Thank
that's
you.
part of our responsibility is maintaining that balance.
I totally echo Commissioner Decker's very well stated comment.
Thank you to both of you. I appreciate those answers.
Can I incorporate everything Commissioner Jackson said into my remarks as well?
Wonderful. Well, with those, I do apologize to all of those that still have questions in the queue. Apparently, we need to continue this conversation another day. There's still a lot more to discuss, but I'll turn it back over to you, Flo, for any last comments before we close things out.
I just want to thank our panelists for participating in this wonderful panel, and good luck to everyone out there on thinking about what kind of police management or civilian oversight will work best in your community. And we're here to answer your questions and provide advice going forward.
Thank you, Flo. And I also want to extend my thanks to all three of you, for sharing your expertise, your perspective, and through all of that, your passion for the work. So thank you so much. I also want to thank you, Flo, for developing today's session and all the work that you continue to do for NACOL. So thank you. Our webinar series will continue, so please watch your inboxes for information on our next educational opportunity. And with that, thank you again, and we will see all of you next time. Thank you.
Thank you all.